Hello, friends. Okay, so trauma talk number 2. So, first, we were just kind of defining what trauma is and what trauma means. So, in therapy world, some of the words that are used are that there's different types of traumas. And so, if we start to kind of put this apart so that there's more understanding for you, one of the things that I like to do in classification is say that there are global traumas, and in therapy speak, they'll say big T traumas. You'll often hear that, or if you Google it, that may come up. And then I'm going to say there's personal traumas. And again, in that therapy speak, oftentimes it's called small t traumas. I find that invalidating to say big versus small. It makes sense in many ways, but it invalidates that when you say small, it diminishes the trauma, because in my work, there are people who have what I call personal traumas who are as traumatized, if not more traumatized sometimes, than people who have global traumas. So, what do I mean when I say global versus personal traumas? Global trauma generally means that majority of people across even the world, across gender, across cultural variations, because certainly there are, in one culture something might be traumatizing where in another culture it's not perceived as traumatizing, so it therefore doesn't create the distress and the response that we often talk about when we're talking about trauma. So these are recognized globally. In general, majority of people are going to say, wow, that's a trauma, that's traumatic. Okay. And so to give some examples, I have a list here. We have things such as early neglect, when young children, babies, toddlers are neglected. Most people across the world will see that as trauma. Sexual, physical, emotional, psychological abuse. Majority of people will understand that that is traumatic. And again, it crosses cultures, genders, age, all these different things. Any kind of sexual assault. So sexual assault, victims of sexual assault. People, again, it's very understandable that that is a traumatic situation. Car accidents, plane crashes, moving motor vehicles, things like that. Any kind of significant accident. People, again, understand that there is trauma to that. War, anything to do with warfare. And again, that understanding, has really come a long way in the last 30 years. And I'm so thankful for that, because it's absolutely a big, significant trauma that people suffer from. Natural disasters of all different types, and the loss and the different things that go on with natural disasters. Seeing violence. So it could be something very violent happening to self, and it can be happening to someone else, which can sometimes even be more significant, or certainly as significant, watching somebody go through something very violent. So witnessing these things. Sudden unexpected death of a loved one. Most people, again, very traumatic. Adoption, adopting young children, especially with trauma, can be very traumatizing. I think people are starting to understand that and see that, but also being adopted is very traumatizing, and that's really understood and has been researched, for the last 70 years very heavily, that type of situation is very traumatic for most people to be adopted, to not be with biological parents or caregivers and whatnot. And again, that goes along with this young abandonment. Terrorist attacks, certainly that's everywhere in the media and things like that. So this is not an exhaustive list. There can be other traumas, but you can see where there is a global and these are validated. I mean, majority of the time people see these as traumatic and they validate that it's traumatic. And so, they even say, wow, how did you go through this type of thing? And so I call that a global trauma. I like the wording better. So then we have personal traumas. And like I said, I see all the time that these are cause just as much anxiety, depression, trauma symptoms, things like that. And we'll talk more about that later. So let me give some examples, because again, this list could really go way beyond this, but I'll at least give you some examples of what I'm talking about. The more frequent these things happen in someone's life, the more traumatizing as well. So sometimes there'll be many, even over years, months, weeks of these type of things. And so that's what we call complex trauma. And I'll talk about that more as well. So breakups, loss of pets, friends, teachers, significant people in our life, and just really any kind of loss. Again, so now we can even go into, maybe it is expected death, but certainly very personally traumatic when certain people die or are lost in our lives. So we certainly see many types of rejection and abandonment that fall into personal traumas. Being invalidated by other people. So this could be caregivers, this could be school, this could be teachers, this can be friends, this can be therapists. Therapists, unfortunately invalidate their clients, and it can be really traumatizing for clients. I mean, this could be really in anything, but in validation, the research in the last 20 years has just boomed on invalidation, and just being invalidated, feeling like you're not accepted for having an emotion or an experience or being you, okay, is very traumatic for people. So whatever it is that you are experiencing and other people shun that out, they don't accept it, or they tell you you're too sensitive, or in some way or another, it's really the perception that's traumatizing. It's not the words or actions themselves, but it's the perceiving of shame. I am not good enough. I am broken. Something's wrong with me. I can't handle it. It's these internalizations from these invalidating experiences that create trauma. And again, we see lots of complex trauma happening from validation, and there's lots of research. Being bullied. Huge. Again, that one's really becoming known, and and maybe crossing into this global trauma, because people are starting to really understand that and see that across borders. But it can be all different kinds of bullying too. The things that maybe some people may not think are significant can certainly be very traumatizing for people. Relationship conflicts. Again, when we really care about a relationship, whatever the context is, it could be a boss, a coworker, a friend, an intimate relationship. It goes on and on and on. A cousin, whatever it is, we care about the relationship. Certain conflicts, and especially unresolved conflict, can be traumatizing. Divorce, separation, again, going into that conflict, loss, whatnot. Work conflicts, huge. We see this all the time, and people really invalidate this. But work conflicts that, one person may not feel is very conflictual and traumatizing, another person is completely traumatized by it. So I see this all the time, and I've experienced this so wholeheartedly. I think that is one that isn't recognized enough. Illness can be very traumatizing. All kinds of illnesses, right? And we lose ability, functions, things of this nature, very traumatizing. Medical procedures. Actually, number one reason for people to get PTSD is invasive medical procedures. And what's invasive to one person or another can vary greatly, but and again, it's invalidated because it may have been needed, but that doesn't take away that the body and the mind perceived it as a violation, and therefore trauma, PTSD. There are more people walking around with medical PTSD than there are combat PTSD, rape victims, things like that. No, I'm not saying that those don't create PTSD, because they have high, incidences of PTSD, and it absolutely. But I think we're not aware of that medical trauma is actually, I mean, there's, so many people have all these illnesses and medical invasive procedures and things like that, and it's becoming more and more known. What's not known is that it's creating a lot of trauma responses for people, and that can be healed. So it doesn't mean to not do the medical. It's like we often need to, right? But we need to learn that we need to heal it and be able to move through those things. Relocation, moving, transitions, loss of job, huge. Loss of job, loss of identity with anything, right? Legal trouble, unexpected sudden expenses that we weren't prepared for, and financial worries. So I think I've named quite a few, but certainly, like I said, it's not exhaustive. There are other things that could create this, but I want that understanding. I want everyone to just understand that trauma, and the definition of trauma, is much broader than what we, often think and understand and know about, especially just in kind of general population. So global traumas, personal traumas, both significant, both can create the same symptoms, and both can turn into incidental PTSD, as well as complex trauma, as well as anxiety disorders, other anxiety disorders, including like obsessive compulsive. Many times it's trauma that will create obsessive compulsive things. So that's not always the case, but certainly I see it and have worked with it many times. Depression. I mean, it's hard not to, once we've felt traumatized by things, to not have some depression, things like that come in. So these experiences that so many of us are feeling, that are really, truly, actually very normal, of depression, anxiety, things like that, oftentimes there are traces of trauma that are behind them. And I think, we're pretty understanding of the global traumas, and most people are like, "Oop, this is what caused it. This is what caused your suffering." But the personal traumas oftentimes aren't recognized, that they really, and the accumulation of them can really cause a lot of problems. So I think that's it on that topic, and let me know on Facebook if you have any questions. Namaste.